This little kitchen appliance might be the cheapest way to start growing mushrooms at home. Normally, if you want to make clean grain spawn, everyone tells you the same thing. You need a real pressure cooker. And I have indeed made a lot of grain spawn that way. But today, I want to see how far this cheaper setup can actually go. So I'm using an Instant Pot style electric pressure cooker to make grain spawn and figuring out whether this cheaper method is actually worth trusting with your grow. Because if this works, home mushroom growing gets a whole lot cheaper. But if you misunderstand the limitations, you might spend the next 3 weeks growing contamination instead of mushrooms. Let's get into it. So I'm using an Instant Pot style electric pressure cooker, and I'm here to find out if this cheaper method is actually worth trusting with your precious mushroom grow. A quick note for clarity, this is technically an 8-quart Dumos electric pressure cooker, not the official Instant Pot brand. But a lot of people use the term Instant Pot as shorthand for this kind of countertop electric cooker. So that's probably what I'll call it throughout this video. The important question isn't the logo on the front, it's whether this low pressure cooking system can get grain clean enough to grow mushrooms from. And to make the most of this, we really need to understand one important trade-off. Most stovetop pressure cookers run at about 15 psi, which gets the inside of the cooker up to around 250 degrees Fahrenheit. For home mushroom growing, a common benchmark for spawn sterilization is around 90 minutes at 15 psi. But most Instant Pot style electric pressure cookers generally run at a lower pressure, so they won't get quite that hot. For sterilization, what really matters though isn't just your peak temperature. It's really more about temperature held over time. So for my grain jars today, since I'm working with lower pressure, I'm going to double the sterilization time. And that is the whole key to this video. Lower pressure means a longer cycle. So before we trust this thing with 3 hours of cook time, we need to make sure the jars that we're putting inside of it are actually worth sterilizing. I've already made multiple videos covering grain prep, modified lids, and loading jars, so I'm not going to turn this into a whole separate tutorial here. I'll throw one of those videos in the description along with the basic materials that I'm using today. For this test to mean anything, the grain needs to be prepared properly. Today, I'm using whole oats, and the goal with our grain is simple. We want it hydrated on the inside and dry on the outside. Since I want to end up with 4 1-quart jars about 2/3 of the way full, I'll start with about 1.5 quarts of dry oats or 6 cups. Once I measure that out and throw it in the pot, I cover them with a generous amount of water and simmer them until they're plump but not bursting. Then I'll drain them really well and let them steam off until the outside looks visibly dry. And something you can do here to test whether or not these grains are dry enough is to put a paper towel on top of the grains, then put a handful of grains on top of that paper towel. After about 30 seconds or so, lift up the paper towel. If the paper towel is still dry or just has a couple of tiny wet spots like this one, that's when I consider them dry enough to load into jars. For the lids on our jars, I've modified these a little bit to have a filtered gas exchange and an injection port because mycelium need that air exchange to breathe, but we still want to keep contaminants out. Then I'll cover the lids with foil to keep any water from dripping into the filters during the pressure cycle. And that's about all I'm going to cover here because again, this video is really about the cooker. But this part does still matter. The Instant Pot can help clean up the jar, but it cannot fix bad grain prep, soaked filters, or jars that were just loaded wrong from the start. So with these jars ready, now we can find out what this electric pressure cooker can actually do. Before we turn the pressure cooker on, we need to check a couple of important things. Make sure the sealing ring, that little gasket in the top, is properly seated. Make sure the vent isn't obstructed in any way. We definitely don't want this thing to explode in our kitchen. Pressure and steam are involved, so this is not the part that you really want to just freestyle or wing it. Read your manual, make sure the unit is working properly, and don't overload it. Now, we want to keep these jars off the bottom of the cooker so they aren't directly on the heating element. Most electric pressure cookers come with a metal trivet, and that usually works fine. Mine unfortunately did not, so I'm just going to use some extra mason jar lid rings along the bottom. Since I'm doing a longer 3-hour run here, I'm going to add enough water to come about 1/3 of the way up these jars. We're not trying to fully submerge them, I just want plenty of water in here so the cooker can produce steam for the entire 3-hour cycle without running dry. If a batch were to run dry mid-sterilization, I probably wouldn't trust it. So follow your model's minimum liquid requirements, don't go over any max fill lines, and for a longer cycle like this, don't cut it too close and skimp out on the water. Now, this 8-quart cooker gives me just enough room for 4 1-quart jars. And funny enough, my actual pressure cooker doesn't even look that much bigger on camera, despite it being able to fit over twice as many jars. And this is really where the limitation of these Instant Pots becomes blatantly obvious. This doesn't have nearly the same internal capacity as a 23-quart pressure cooker. So if you're trying to prep a huge batch of grain jars or perhaps grain bags, this probably isn't the tool for that. And mind you, 4 jars really is the hard limit. In fact, I have to leave this little gap here in between the jars, otherwise the lid won't fit on properly. Now, I've had so many comments on my channel saying this next step in the process doesn't matter, and I couldn't disagree more. I think it's hugely important to the proper function of this device. Once the jars are loaded, I'm going to close the lid, turn the cooker on, and leave the valve set to vent. As the cooker warms up, steam should start to come out of this vent. Once steam is coming out, I'm gonna let the cooker vent steadily for about 5 minutes. And the idea here is similar to venting a normal pressure cooker. We're trying to push out trapped air and fill the chamber with hot steam. That's so important because trapped air does not transfer heat as efficiently as steam. After our 5 minutes of venting, I'll switch the valve over to seal and let the cooker run for 3 hours. And grain jars are really just the start here because honestly, grain isn't even where this cooker shines most. Grain is probably the use case where I'm most cautious. It can work, but grain is dense, nutritious, and pretty unforgiving. Now, this is where electric pressure cookers become one of our most versatile tools in mushroom growing. Agar and liquid culture. Unlike grain jars, agar and liquid culture are generally smaller volume media, so they heat through much more evenly. Because of this, they don't need anything close to the same 3-hour cycle. For agar, I generally run it for about 20 minutes at 15 psi in my regular pressure cooker. So to scale that in this electric pressure cooker, I'd bump that closer to about 30 minutes for a 500 milliliter bottle or 20 of my no-pour plates, if that's what you use. That'll give it a little extra time without completely overdoing it. Liquid culture is similar, but I'm a little more careful there because sugar-based recipes can darken or caramelize if you cook them too long. So for liquid culture, I run somewhere around 25 to 30 minutes depending on the jar size and quantity. But really the big point is this: grain needs a long cycle. Agar and liquid culture, on the other hand, usually just need a little extra time compared to that of a normal pressure cooker. So instead of thinking of this device exclusively as a grain jar workaround, it's probably better to think of it as a small batch mycology tool. It can help with grain, agar, liquid culture, small tools, and possibly even pasteurization. But that last one has a trap that's easy to miss. Some pressure cookers also have a warm function that a lot of people like to use for pasteurization. But don't just assume your model holds the right temperature. If you're using this for pasteurization, you need to check the temperature with a thermometer. Otherwise, you're just guessing and hoping whatever you're trying to pasteurize actually gets pasteurized. Now, let's come back to grain jars real quick because the cycle finishing does not mean we start rushing. Once the cycle finishes, I'm not going to force release the pressure or open the cooker right away. Just like a normal pressure cooker, I like to let everything cool naturally because a rapid pressure drop can push moisture up toward the lid and the filter. And if that filter gets soaked, it's not the clean, dry barrier that I want it to be anymore. So instead of rushing the step, I usually just leave the jars alone for several hours or oftentimes even overnight. The grain needs to be back at room temperature before you add your culture anyway, otherwise your mycelium is just going to get fried. I know it's hard, but try your best to be patient here. Now, sometimes after a long cycle, the grain can settle or clump up a little bit. So once the jars are fully cool, I like to take them out, remove the foil, and give them a quick shake to loosen any of the grains back up before I use them. And from here, the pressure cooker's job is basically done. These jars are prepped, cooled, and shaken loose, which means we can finally answer the question this whole video started with. Can an Instant Pot style electric pressure cooker get us inoculation ready grain jars? For small beginner batches, yeah. I think this method is super useful. But once again, I'd treat it as a small batch mycology tool, not a full replacement for a true stovetop pressure cooker. It makes the most sense for a few grain jars, agar, liquid culture, and small tools in situations where you already have one sitting in your kitchen. Where I'd be cautious is with anything big and dense, like large spawn bags or giant substrate bags, because the more mass that needs to be sterilized, the harder it is to trust that the center reached and held temperature long enough. Now, if you're ready to take your fancy new grain jars and get them all inoculated, I would check out this video next so you don't make any of those common mistakes. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy growing.